Okay, so we're continuing our dialogue on your book, Empathy and Morality. This is part two, and you were going to just say something, Heidi?
Yeah. So, what is some of the things that Graham and Garrett are pointing to that helps expanding empathy? Is partly what Hoffman also talked about, namely the empathetic narratives, right? So novels and movies about the plights of mistreated people is often quite effective in changing attitudes, right? And one of the things that they point to is that Uncle Tom's Cabin supposedly having the effect of getting people to empathize not just with Uncle Tom, but with all slaves, for instance, right? That's a huge group of people. Now, if that's possible, then it seems there's no principal difficulties expanding that, right? So Peter Singer has talked about the expanding circle of concern for others, which you might also think is equally possible with the empathetic concern for others, right? Where you might originally be concerned just with you and yours or your tribe, and then, with, I don't know, Americans, human beings, but even that can be expanded, right? So a lot of people are now concerned with the plight of non-human animals, who are largely regarded merely as means to an end, who in factory farming is kept under horrific conditions so that we can eat cheap meat, right? And so I think what Garrett and Graham are talking to is that actually what we do see is we see the expansion of empathy in action.
Well, that's really what I'm looking at too, is how do we expand the empathy and really make a culture of empathy where empathy becomes a primary social value in society. And I know that a lot of people criticize empathy, say, oh, it's just an in-group phenomenon, but I spent many years traveling around and I had like great connections with people all over the world, and it was they weren't family members, and in some cases at that time of my life the connections were even more deep than I'd had with family members. So this whole notion of just in-group, I think, is somehow overdone. That it's not as rigid as sometimes it's portrayed to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think a really important thing is to consider the effect of cultural values on the emotions that we nourish, right? So if you look at Buddhist culture, right, there is a tremendous value on compassion, right, for all living beings, including non-human animals, right? So if you're a good Buddhist, you will be a vegetarian. And so that's a deeply entrenched culture. And by the way, there's also close connections in Hinduism. Hinduism and Buddhism kind of develop together. Right? In the West, there are very different attitudes. And you might think that the premium on compassion isn't as big here now as it has been in those cultures. That's not to say that perhaps it's been implemented the best way. I'm not saying that, right? But there is certainly a cultural valuing of it, right? And if you think about a lot of Buddhist techniques are exactly cultivating compassion, right? By focusing on experiencing compassion for the ever-expanding circle of creatures moving, as it were, away from your center, right? Including, for instance, your enemies, which, if I remember rightly, Jesus talked about too. Right?
Mm-hmm. Well, you're from Denmark, and Denmark always gets high ratings in terms of happiness on the happiness index. It's considered the #1 or #2 in terms of the happiest countries. And I interviewed a director, Rocco Bellic, who created the movie Happy, the movie, which has been shown a lot here in the United States. And I asked him about the relationship of empathy and happiness, and he said, well, empathy is the gateway because it's the human connection. He spent 5 years traveling around the world. He actually went to Denmark as well and had a story from Denmark. So he's saying that the social connection was what was causing the happiness from his findings. So I would just assume and extrapolate that Denmark would be an empathic country, because if they're rating so high on empathy, I don't know if that, and that kind of relates to, does the culture itself kind of teach these values from the ground up, from early childhood? And I guess I'm wanting to kind of check with you since you're from there.
Oh, I mean, it's always dangerous to speculate exactly what the details are. I mean, I don't know whether empathy or compassion is a greater value in Denmark than in other surrounding countries. I mean, I think one of the things you have to consider is that it's a country that has great social welfare, so that you don't see the social inequality. I mean, the social inequalities that appear to be inherent in the American capitalist system are just not, you just don't see them in Denmark. So, and there's much more sense of everybody gets a chance to participate. I think that the sort of capitalistic attitudes that I perceive as being more present in North America are, I think, not quite as prevalent. There seems to be more of a focus on free time, spending time with family and friends and children. And I think all of those things are things that research have suggested leads to greater happiness. Money, by comparison, does relatively little. That is, once you reach a certain level of economic, once you have a certain level of income, which doesn't need to be particularly high, there are negligible effects on happiness of earning more over that. The biggest effects, right, are from social relationships with other people.
And those social relationships are fostered through empathy.
Pocket philosophizing. Oh, sorry?
And those relationships are fostered through empathic connection, I would say. Yeah, I mean, there's certainly an interplay, I would say, yeah. Okay, well, we're going from connection to Chapter 7, which is by Abigail Marsh, Empathic and Moral Deficits in Psychopathy. So that was our next chapter. Yeah, so Abigail Marsh works on psychopathy. And she is particularly interested in the relationship between fear and psychopathy. So one of the old, which is not to say defunct, but older views of psychopathy is that it's a disorder of fearlessness. David Lykken was suggested this some years ago. And it is certainly true that psychopaths don't appear to experience fear in the same way, or being as fearful as non-psychopaths are. So one of the things that Abigail was interested in was the extent to which that plays a role in their interactions with others on the empathy front. So the question is empathy with fear in others, right? So her view is that the psychopaths don't appear to empathize with fear in others. And that is one consistent area in which they also appear to have deficits in moral judgment. So if you do tests of psychopaths and non-psychopaths on various statements of how wrong is it to do this, that, and the other, or is it always wrong to do this, that, and the other. Statements about causing fear in others, most people think that's very wrong. Psychopaths think it's a little less wrong. They also still think it's wrong, but not as wrong as non-psychopaths do.
And of course, one of the things that psychopaths, some psychopaths, I should say, do, is that they manipulate, threaten, and coerce other people to do what they want them to do, right? And so you would think, well, if you don't think that causing fear in others is a bad thing, right, then the kinds of behaviors that are associated with it would go down. But that ability to see causing fear in others is a bad thing, Abigail suggests, depends on the ability to appreciate how bad it is to be afraid. And without empathy for fear, you just don't have that ability. So that is a very, if you like, specific coupling point. You might think of the ability to appreciate the wrongness of something and the ability to appreciate what it's like to be the subject of that.
Okay.
So most people regard fear as being a really bad thing, right? It's terrible to be really afraid. It's terrible to fear for your life. That's one important reason why you don't make people fear of their own life, for instance, right? But it seems like psychopaths aren't really capable of appreciating that.
Okay, so they don't have the fear. They're not having the fear for themselves so it's harder for them to feel the fear in others or appreciate what the effect of having that fear in others is, basically.
Well, yeah, I mean, roughly speaking, I mean, the evidence about fear in psychopaths is extremely complicated. So psychopaths have intact fear responses under certain circumstances, but under other circumstances, it's odd. In particular, if psychopaths are pursuing a goal, fear doesn't seem to play a big role in preventing them from pursuing that goal, for instance, right? But, I mean, it would be false to say they don't experience fear at all. It's just that they have fear deficiencies, let's put it that way. But it's certainly also true that they have empathic fear deficiencies, according to Marsh's research.
Okay, and I did a previous interview with her too, so had talked with her. So then, let's see, there's chapter 8, and let me put that up on the screen. So, and who are the contributors there? It's Giuseppe Ugazio and
Jasminka Majdancic.
You have trouble too. Good. I'm not the only one.
The name, and Klaus Lam. So a research group based in, I believe it is Berlin, although I know
Giuseppe. It looks like Vienna is the University of Vienna, the three of them.
Oh dear. Yes, sorry.
And are empathy and morality linked? Evidence for moral psychology, social and decision, neuroscience, and philosophy.
Yes. What they suggest is that empathy plays an epistemological role in allowing others by vicariously experiencing their affect. So without empathy, we won't really be able to appreciate how our actions affect others or how other people's actions affect other people, right? So that's kind of a little bit related to what Abigail was talking about there with empathy with fear. And they also point out that empathy plays a motivational role. So if we feel either sympathy for someone who is in distress or vicarious distress, empathetic distress, we can be motivated to assist them. So empathy can play both a role in helping us appreciate how actions affect others, and motivating us in the right way, or of course that's prejudging the issue somewhat, but can motivate us to help or assist others in need. But it can also, that doesn't of course show that it's the same as moral understanding or moral motivation, right? So one of the things that they point to is that there are, of course, various views about what is morally right and wrong, particularly when it comes to moral dilemmas, right? So one aspect of the moral psychology literature over the recent years is the so-called utilitarian versus deontological judgment idea. So namely, there's been a lot of criticism about using these kinds of labels, but the idea is, roughly speaking, you might have dilemmas in which you have to decide whether you let one die to save the many, right? So the classical example is the trolley example, right, where you imagine that for some reason you're standing next to a railroad line where there's a switch that will allow you to switch the whatever train is coming on the tracks onto one or the other, right? You see there's a runaway trolley coming down the track, you look down the track and you see, oh, the track diverges. On one track there's one hiker, on the other there are 5. As it stands currently, the trolley is about to go down the trail with the 5 hikers. And now the question is it morally permissible for you to switch so that only one dies as opposed to 5 people die, right? The way this particular literature uses deontological versus utilitarian, which doesn't match really the philosophical use particularly well, is that they say, well, if you choose to save the many, that's a utilitarian judgment. If you say, oh, I can't interfere, I can't sacrifice the one to save the many, then that's a deontological. It's based on the rule that you're not allowed to harm, right? So in a certain sense, if you stand aside, then you're not doing anything, you're just watching things happen. And as you can imagine, there are all kinds of variations of this kind of scenario, right? Some where we're more likely to say, well, you can't sacrifice the one to save the many. So imagine that we have 5 people who are all in the hospital who will die if they don't get an organ transplant, and we get somebody in for a routine examination. Should we just kill them because then we can save the 5 by taking their organs? Most people would say, no, you can't do that, right? So that's a strong intuition in favor of you can't kill the one to save the many. But in the standard trolley case, it seems like more people are sympathetic to the option or the permissibility of diverging the trolley so the one person dies and the 5 people are saved. Okay. Now, it turns out that if you induce empathy, then for the one person, then you're more likely for people to judge that utilitarian options are wrong, right? And in a lot of various games, if you induce empathy for one person, people become very biased towards allocating resources to that one person, even if it's worse for everybody, that this one person gets a lot and other people will get very little, right? So plausibly, you would think, well, maybe that's not the best option, the best moral option, right? And so their view is, look, I mean, empathy can play this really important role in helping us appreciate what it's like from the other person's perspective by motivating us in the right way, but it can also play the role, as it were, in the opposite direction. We might overvalue what somebody is feeling compared to the ill effects it might otherwise have, all the suffering that might be caused in this way. Or we might be motivated to sacrifice many people so that one person doesn't die or something like that sort, right? So empathy is manipulable, right? And so therefore, and when it's manipulated in this way, it may very well conflict with what we think is morally right or wrong. So that suggests that there is an important distinction here, and so although empathy may play an important role in appreciating perhaps why something is morally wrong and to motivate us in appropriate ways, empathy is not, doesn't play an essential role in all forms of moral thinking or reasoning.
The only one point I wanted to make there is the sense that if you're empathizing with the one person on the track and you might favor them, and so therefore there's sometimes I get that notion, I hear that makes empathy itself, that creates a negative aspect about empathy, is, oh, you're empathizing with that person, you're going to favor them over the other. And for me, it's not the empathy it's the favoritism. And what it is, there's a lack of empathy for the other side. It's the same story that comes up in a court case that Paul Bloom was mentioning. So in a court, you're empathizing with one party, and therefore the empathy is bad because you're favoring that person over the others. And it's empathy that is kind of like at fault, and that's a negative aspect. But it seems to me what it is, it's a lack of empathy for both sides. And so it's more the lack of empathy that's, quote, at fault. Does that make sense?
Right, but the problem is, I think that you might empathize with both people in a conflict, and that might not get you anywhere, right? And you might think, well, look, when we make decisions about what is right and wrong, we can empathize with me, we can empathize with the other person, but that might not get us to where we're going. So the question might be, well, maybe we can empathize with various people, and then in addition we have to make
that judgment or
a judgment.
Okay. Well, I want to keep moving because we want to cover all the chapters here. We're on chapter 9 here. Peter Hobson and Jessica Hobson on empathy perspective from developmental psychology.
Yeah, I think we already talked about that.
Okay. Yeah, we covered that in the previous part. So we could move on to Kristen Andrews and Laurie Brunin, empathy and other apes.
Yeah. So I mean, so Kristen and Laurie are essentially talking about various ways of understanding empathy, various ways in which it had been thought that non-human animals, or apes in particular, cannot experience empathy, what the difficulties are there. So some people think it doesn't make sense to say that apes can experience something like empathy because they don't have an understanding of belief, and so that rests on a particular understanding of what is required to empathize. You need to understand something about the other person's state of mind, and you need to be able to ascribe belief states and so forth and so on. It's a debate that what they suggest is, or what they say is, that there's a lot of evidence that shows that apes have really quite sophisticated understanding of each other, of the fact that another ape is seeing the same thing as they're seeing. For instance, we talked about that before. And they also go on to talk about empathy and cooperation, and how people think, well, if empathy doesn't have the role of facilitating cooperation, does it really make sense to talk about empathy? And since we don't see cooperation in apes, we don't really see empathy. And what they go on to say is that we do see certain forms of cooperation. A lot of the studies that don't show cooperation are often done in very non-naturalistic settings, right? So a lot of experiments require an ape to cooperate with a human, for instance. It might be very confusing for an ape to understand exactly what is going on. There's also been additional problems, which is that some of the apes that have been used for experiments have been apes that have been raised essentially in isolation. And for hugely social animals, you might end up with probably with a deeply psychologically damaged individuals, right? Imagine taking a child away from its mother at an early age and putting it in a cage and then testing it for its ability at age 14. You wouldn't be able to get very much out of that, I think, either, right? So, I mean, there are various difficulties in the animal literature. It's getting a lot better. People are coming to appreciate much more the idea that animals aren't simply automata that you can mistreat in any way you want, and then you still get a sort of normal animal at the end of it that you can test for its ability, and that can be say something about what that type of animal is capable of or not, right? So I think it's a really fascinating topic. It's a really interesting chapter that might help us think a little bit more about what elements of empathy do or don't do, and how they contribute to social functioning. And I think it's a way of thinking about aspects of empathy, at least. Because, as I said, I mean, there is this question, depending on what you mean by empathy, you know, apes don't have it, or they can have it. I think it gives us a more unbiased view of it, because we don't tend to imbue our interpretation of non-human animals with the same normative categories as we do when we look at what people do, right? There's an enormous amount of normativity involved when we think about what humans do or do not do. So,
okay.
I think it's really useful for that reason.
So it kind of gives you a different view. I hear what normative is, do we have all these judgments maybe and ideas around empathy in humans? By looking at animals, we have a different view on the nature of empathy, in a sense, and we can see, is that?
Yes, I mean, I think one of the tendencies that Kristen Andrews has pointed to too in a series of fascinating articles is that there is a tendency to interpret what people really rich ways, right? In order for you to be able to make this kind of distinctions, well, you have to have an understanding of this, that, and the other. This is really complicated, cognitively speaking, so when we see the same behavior in non-human animals, we merely assume that it's based on instinct because we know that the animal doesn't have all these sophisticated abilities. Of course, sometimes it turns out that, in fact, we're really dumb and we're just doing this stuff based on really simple procedures. But that's typically, I mean, that hasn't been the favored interpretation, right? So typically what we do is super sophisticated. When animals do the same thing, it's just based on brute instinct or something like that, right? And so I think that if animals can do sophisticated stuff and they don't have all this cognitive stuff going on, we have some reason to think that maybe when we do some of the same stuff, it's not because we have all this really sophisticated cognitive stuff going on either. It's obviously not inevitable, but I think it's a good buffer against inflating human intelligence and human cognitive sophistication.
Great. So then we have chapter 11, Tony Ward and Russell Durant, Psychological Altruism, Empathy, and Offender Rehabilitation.
Yes, so what Ward and Durant are doing is that they are looking at the connection between empathy, altruism, and aggression. I think that's one way of looking at it. That's when we're thinking about offender rehabilitation in particular, right? So Empathy training is in many criminal system plays an important role in supposedly rehabilitating offenders, right? And so the assumption here seems to be that, as we discussed before, empathy plays an important part in the do not part of morality. Okay? Now, one of the problems with the empathy approach is that for a lot of offenders, general ability to empathize is not the problem. So, in a number of studies with rapists and with pedophiles, show perfect normal ability to empathize with people in general. It's just that they don't empathize with the victim group, right? So a pedophile can perfectly well empathize with a woman who has been raped, but does not empathize or sympathize with children under the same circumstances, right? Now that suggests that people have intact empathy, but perhaps they have a greater motivation to commit the crime that they're committing, so they're overriding the empathy. So providing them with more empathy training might not be the way to go, because they are already fine in general. What you need to have something specifically oriented towards perhaps the victim group or something like that. So what Ward and Durand are focusing on is really they're focusing on
We had a little breakup with the audio there for the last part. You were saying what they're focusing on. Sorry, it was just the audio cut out. They were focusing on like specifics, like if, for example, a pedophile is not, they have empathy in general, but they don't have it for the specific group, and so it's they're kind of, are they looking at how to foster empathy for that specific group, or?
Well, what they're saying is that they're focusing on what they call an altruism approach. Now that does have as a component an empathy training where they're particularly interested in taking victims' perspective to some extent, right? But the idea here is the is on fostering an altruistic attitude towards others is a way to go here that also includes, I just want to say, emotional regulation, which somebody like Eisenberg talked about as well, if you recall. So there's an interesting connection in that chapter with what Eisenberg talks to as well. Talks about. I'm getting tired.
Yeah, okay. Well, let's move on real quick. We've really gone for quite a long time. I'm sorry for I wanted to cover every chapter, and
there's just one chapter left, which is a Douglas Collins chapter. So let me see. I just wanna
have it.
A short advertisement for his own book here. Empathy, what's the anthropology of empathy, which he co-edited with Jason Throop. And so what Holland does is that he focuses on or examines empathy in Polynesia, if I remember correctly. So what his concern is to figure out what is the value of empathy in various groups and how is empathy regarded in societies other than what we might call Western liberal societies. And of course, there are a lot of interesting differences, and I can't really do the chapter justice because we have a lot of discussions of various attitudes and various cultures, which I think is really important for understanding empathy more broadly. But one of the things that he does say is that in most cultures, empathy is not, or in most of the cultures that he examines, I should say, empathy is not regarded as a uniformly good thing. Now, one of the aspects of empathy he's concerned with is cognitive empathy. So, being understood or understanding what other people think. A lot of people are a little wary of that. Partly because if people understand what you think and what you feel, it's easier to manipulate you. Right? So I think it's a really fascinating chapter to see that what kinds of pros and cons are there to various forms of empathy in different cultures, and why are they valued under these circumstances and not under other circumstances. And I mean, he's also talking about cultures where specifically there's a focus on this expanding circle that we talked about before, that empathy is expanded from close family out to other members of the group too, right? So there again, I think we have an interesting connection with other chapters of the book.
Okay, great. We've really covered this in depth. Thank you for spending so much time going into depth and giving me a chance too to kind of throw in some ideas and for being patient in my understanding. I'm not a philosopher, so it takes me sometimes a while to get some of these concepts. So, so thank you so much, Heidi, for sharing. And this is the book here. This is the other way. Which way? That's the way to empathy and morality. And thank you so much for this great discussion.
Can I just say one thing before we're done?
Okay.
So I just want to say, to the best of my ability, I have portrayed these chapters. I do. I mean, I think that the final word is obviously with the authors themselves, and I may not have done. I mean, I've picked certain ideas from certain chapters because you can't really go through them in detail, etc. But if you really want to know what people think, read their own contribution, and if it conflicts with anything I've said, I was wrong.
Oh, great. Thank you for that caveat. And with that, I'll end the broadcast until next time.